So apparently I can't count, and this would be step 12 of 11. All along there were 11 steps in building a turnout, but it turns out that there's a 12th one that I forgot all about, which is cutting the gaps in the rail around the frog. This is absolutely critical for any turnouts built in our tools. Without the gaps cut in the rails, there'll be a dead short on the turnout. On every turnout built in our tools, there will be 2 PC board ties in front of a frog and 2 PC board ties behind it. And the purpose of this is to give you a spot to cut a gap through the rail, and it'll provide the support needed to hold the rail with those gaps cut in it. In the case of this turnout, there needs to be a gap cut here and a gap cut here. So by cutting these gaps in the rail, what we're doing is electrically isolating the frog from the rest of the turnout. Now you can see the gaps in the PC board ties around the frog, gaps here and gaps here, so now that is an island in the middle of the turnout with no electrical connection. We control the frog from either a switch machine or other contacts that will switch the polarity of the frog relative to the direction of the turnout. There's a couple of ways of doing this. One is to use a rotary tool like a Dremel with a cutoff wheel, and you go down in between the ties with the cutoff wheel and slice through the rail. For the larger scales, that will work. It's got a few drawbacks I've always found. One is the width of the cutoff wheel is a bit on the wide side, and it makes for a bit of an unsightly gap in here. Another is in the smaller scales, there's not enough clearance between the rail you're cutting and the rail adjacent to it to get the wheel down in there. So you end up with a nick in the side of the rail, if not cutting right through it if you're not careful. So on the smaller turnouts especially, that's not such a desirable way of doing it. And one other issue is it generates a lot of heat when you're doing that cutting, and it can actually melt the solder joints near the gap, and the rail can come loose from the PC board tie. Technique that I've found works the best is to use a jeweler saw like this. What's nice with these jeweler saws is you can remove the blade from one end and feed it down in between the PC board ties like that, reattach it to the saw, and then slice down through the rail. This has a lot of advantages. One is the width of the blade is very thin, so it cuts a gap that's just about invisible afterwards. And with this technique of construction where the rail is soldered to PC board ties, you don't have to worry so much about filling in the gap, because the rails can't expand and close that gap because they're soldered solid on these ties. They don't slide in and out like they do on commercial track. The biggest advantage, however, is when you're cutting gaps in small pieces of track like this Z-scale number 4 turnout. The only way to really get a gap cut in there is to feed in the blade of a jeweler saw down in here and slice through that. If you tried doing this with a rotary tool, it would be impossible to get it in there and get the gaps cut. When you mount the blade in the saw, it's very important that you mount the teeth pointing back towards the handle of the saw. You want to be able to cut on the back stroke, not on the push stroke, because on the push stroke it has a tendency to want to curl up the blade. So I mount the turnout into a bench of ice that's been securely bolted down, and that leaves both hands free to help guide the saw. The blade of the jeweler saw is fed down in between the 2 PC board ties and then snugged back up into the saw. And it's important to adjust the tension on the blade too. You want it to be very taut. It should actually almost be like a guitar string when it's in place. It takes a few passes in the forward stroke to get started. Once you get down into the meat of the material, it's a lot easier to work the blade back and forth. Once you get the blade moving, it's best to keep it moving back and forth, right all the way down, right until you're through the entire piece of rail. And when you get down near the last few bits of the cut, the blade will have a tendency to want to grab a little bit. So I find that what seems to work best is to do the last couple of strokes in the forward stroke, like that. There we go. That's all nice, cut nice and clean. After the gaps are cut, it's very important that you inspect the turnout to make sure that there's no little burrs bridging that gap. And if you look on this one, you can see that there are some small little flakes of metal there that are almost bridging that gap. It's very important we clean those out because it can actually cause a bit of an arc across there when power is applied to the turnout. There's a couple of ways of cleaning that out. You can just give it a brush with the wire brush, and it has a tendency of getting down in there and knocking all the loose stuff out of the gap. Or you can get down in there with the tip of a knife blade. I find this works pretty good, and just carefully pick out whatever little flakes or burrs might be left in there. But it's very critical that those gaps are cleanly cut through. So that is the final step of this turnout build. It's complete and ready to go. The next thing that I would do to this prior to installing it would be to maybe paint it, and that will completely eliminate any chance of the PC board ties starting to discolor, and it just looks a bit ugly. So getting a coat of paint kind of seals that off and gives a more completed look to the turnout. I'm going to cover the process of painting and finishing off these turnouts in a little bit more detail in another series of videos.
Did you ever hear about the railroad rag? Toot, 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 it's a joyful jag. See the train a-going round the curve. I feel that engine swerve. Engineers are humming a peculiar strain. In your heart you get a pain. All the people on the train have caught the drag. Now everybody's humming that railroad rag. Oh, oh, that railroad rag. Oh, oh, that railroad rag. It's so entrancing, hun. It makes you fall asleep in Fargo when you wake up in Chicago. Hear that engine hum. That train is sure going some. Here comes that choo, 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 choo. That's the railroad rag. Once there was a Pullman train of 18 cars, took a trip and went up to Mars. Soon it broke all records, thought I'd die. In 1 hour we reached the sky.